The Wyoming wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls like a mourning cry, carrying with it the bitter promise of another harsh winter. Martha Calloway pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she knelt beside the small vegetable garden behind her homestead, her fingers numb despite the worn leather gloves that had once belonged to her husband. 3 months had passed since the Lakota war party had swept through the valley, leaving nothing but ash and sorrow in their wake. 3 months since she'd found Thomas's body near the creek, his cavalry uniform torn and bloodied, his horse nowhere to be found. The other settlers had abandoned their claims, fleeing east to the safety of the railroad towns, but Martha had nowhere to go. This patch of unforgiving earth was all she had left of the life they'd tried to build together. Her spade struck something hard beneath the frozen soil, the metallic clang echoing in the crisp November air. Brushing away the dirt with trembling fingers, she uncovered a pair of cavalry spurs, their once bright steel, now dulled by rust and neglect. The rowels were caked with mud, and one of the leather straps had rotted away completely, but she recognized them immediately. "Thomas," she whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. These weren't his spurs. His had been buried with him, but they belonged to a cavalryman nonetheless. Perhaps they'd fallen from one of the soldiers who'd come through weeks after the raid, searching for survivors and collecting the dead. Standing slowly, her knees protesting after hours of digging up the last of her potatoes, Martha cradled the spurs against her chest. The metal was cold and rough against her palms, but something about holding them brought her a strange comfort. They were a tangible connection to the world she'd lost, to the man who'd promised her a new life on the frontier. As she walked back toward the cabin, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Martha caught sight of movement on the ridge that overlooked her property. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she strained to make out the figure silhouetted against the dying light. It was a man on horseback, sitting perfectly still, watching her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind continued its mournful song, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the rider turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge, leaving Martha to wonder if she'd imagined the whole encounter. Inside the cabin, she lit her single oil lamp and placed it on the rough-hewn table where she and Thomas used to share their evening meals. The light flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the log walls as she settled into her chair and placed the spurs before her. From a small wooden box, she retrieved a piece of fine steel wool, a precious commodity she'd been saving for truly important tasks. With slow, methodical strokes, Martha began to work on the first spur. The rust came away gradually, revealing glimpses of the polished steel underneath. As she worked, her mind drifted to memories of Thomas polishing his own equipment every evening, his strong hands moving with practiced efficiency as he cleaned his rifle, oiled his holster, and buffed his spurs until they gleamed. "A soldier's gear is his life," he used to say, his blue eyes serious in the lamplight. "You take care of it, and it'll take care of you." The irony wasn't lost on her. His well-maintained equipment hadn't saved him from the Lakota arrows that had found their mark that terrible morning. Nothing could have saved him from the violence that had swept across the territory like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. But still, she polished. There was something soothing about the repetitive motion, the gradual transformation of rust into shine. It gave her hands something to do, and her mind a focus other than the crushing loneliness that threatened to overwhelm her each night. Hours passed unnoticed as Martha worked. The oil in her lamp burned lower, and the wind outside grew stronger, rattling the shutters and sending cold drafts through every crack in the cabin's construction. When she finally looked up from her task, one spur gleamed like new in the lamplight, its steel surface reflecting the flame like a mirror. She held it up, admiring the craftsmanship. These were quality spurs, not the rough military-issue equipment that most cavalrymen wore. The rowels were finely crafted, and delicate engravings decorated the bands, the work of a skilled metalsmith who'd taken pride in his craft. A sudden sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Martha's blood turned to ice as she quietly rose from her chair and reached for Thomas's old Colt revolver, hanging in its holster on a peg by the door. Her hands shook as she checked the cylinder. 5 bullets, all she had left. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her door. Martha held her breath, the pistol heavy in her grip as she waited for whatever was coming. Minutes ticked by in absolute silence, broken only by the wind and the rapid beating of her own heart. Finally, when she could stand it no longer, she crept to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. The yard was empty, bathed in pale moonlight that revealed nothing but the familiar shapes of her small barn and the split-rail fence Thomas had built their first summer. Whatever had been out there was gone, leaving no trace of its presence, except the memory of those deliberate footsteps. But as Martha returned to her chair, her legs weak with relief and residual fear, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. There, beside the door where she was certain nothing had been before, lay a bundle wrapped in hide. She stared at it for a long time, the polished spur still clutched in her hand, wondering what it could mean and who could have left it. In this territory, unexpected gifts often came with unexpected prices, and a woman alone had to be careful about the debts she might unknowingly incur. Tomorrow, she decided, she would investigate. Tonight, she would continue polishing the second spur and try not to think about the rider on the ridge or the mysterious bundle waiting outside her door. Tonight, she would lose herself in the familiar rhythm of steel wool against metal and remember what it felt like to have Thomas sitting across from her, his presence a bulwark against the dangers that lurked in the darkness beyond their small circle of lamplight. Dawn came grey and cold, with heavy clouds promising snow before nightfall. Martha had barely slept, her dreams filled with the sound of footsteps and the memory of that solitary figure watching from the ridge. When she finally gave up on rest and rose from her narrow bed, the first thing she did was peer through the shutters toward her front door. The bundle was still there. She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes, Thomas's old wool shirt over her cotton dress, thick stockings, and the sturdy boots he'd bought for her in Cheyenne before they'd headed west to claim their land. Everything she owned seemed to carry his ghost with it, but this morning she was grateful for the warmth his oversized clothing provided. With the Colt tucked into her belt, Martha unbarred the door and stepped into the bitter morning air. Her breath formed thick clouds as she approached the mysterious gift, her eyes constantly scanning the ridge and tree line for any sign of movement. The bundle was larger than it had appeared from inside, wrapped in what looked like deerskin and bound with sinew. She circled it once, twice, before finally kneeling beside it. The hide was soft and expertly tanned, decorated with small beadwork in patterns she didn't recognize. Whoever had left this possessed considerable skill in leatherwork, and the beads themselves, deep blues and rich reds, were of fine quality. Martha's fingers hesitated over the sinew bindings. Accepting this gift felt like crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross, acknowledging some connection with whoever had left it. But curiosity and the bitter cold finally overcame her caution, and she carefully untied the bundle. What lay inside took her breath away. It was a buffalo robe of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. The hide was thick and luxurious, the fur dense and perfectly preserved. The leather side had been painted with intricate designs, geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story she couldn't read, executed in natural pigments that had been applied with masterful precision. Along the edges, more beadwork created borders of stunning complexity, each tiny bead placed with obvious care and skill. Martha had seen buffalo robes before, traded by Indians at the fort, but nothing approaching this quality. This wasn't simply a practical garment, it was a work of art, something that would have taken months to complete and represented considerable value in any trading post from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. But why would someone leave such a treasure at her door? She lifted the robe, marveling at its weight and warmth. Even in the cold morning air, she could feel the heat it would provide. Her own blankets were thin and worn, barely adequate for the harsh Wyoming winters, and she'd been dreading the thought of trying to survive another month of cold in her drafty cabin. A sound from the ridge made her look up sharply. There he was again, the same rider sitting motionless on his horse watching her. In the clearer light of morning she could make out more details. He wore no hat, his long dark hair moving in the wind, and what appeared to be traditional Indian clothing rather than the white man's attire, adopted by many of the reservation Indians she'd encountered. This time Martha didn't look away. She stood slowly, the buffalo robe clutched in her arms, and stared back at him across the distance. For several long minutes, they regarded each other in silence, the widowed white woman and the Indian who'd somehow known she needed warmth. Then, with a slight movement that might have been a nod, the rider turned his horse and disappeared once again over the ridge. Martha hurried back inside, her heart racing from more than just the cold. She spread the buffalo robe across her bed, running her hands over the magnificent fur and tracing the painted designs with her fingertips. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every line confident and purposeful, every bead perfectly placed. This was the work of someone with not just skill, but genuine artistic vision. That evening, as snow began to fall in earnest outside her windows, Martha sat at her table and continued working on the second spur. The buffalo robe lay across her shoulders like a warm embrace, its weight comforting in a way she hadn't expected.
Thank you.
The heat it provided was luxurious after months of shivering through the nights, but it was more than mere warmth. It felt like protection, like someone watching over her. As she polished, her mind wandered to the rider on the ridge. Clearly, he was Lakota. The beadwork patterns on the robe's wrapping and the painting style were consistent with what she'd learned about their artistic traditions during her brief time at Fort Laramie. But why would a Lakota warrior, one of the same people who'd killed her husband, show such kindness to a white woman? The steel wool moved rhythmically against the metal, gradually revealing more of the spur's original beauty. These too showed fine craftsmanship, and as she worked, Martha began to make out the engravings more clearly. There were words etched into the steel, partially obscured by rust but becoming legible as she cleaned, for valor on one side, and what appeared to be initials on the other, JMC, Joseph Michael Calloway. Her husband's full name, though she'd never seen these particular spurs before. They must have been a presentation pair awarded for some act of bravery during his earlier service. Thomas had rarely spoken of his military career before they'd married, preferring to focus on their future rather than dwell on the violence he'd witnessed. The discovery made her hands tremble slightly as she continued polishing. These spurs weren't just random cavalry equipment, they were specifically Thomas's, somehow lost and buried in her own garden. But how had they come to be there? He'd been wearing his regular spurs when she'd found his body, and those had been buried with him according to military custom. A new sound interrupted her thoughts, not footsteps this time, but the soft nickering of a horse. Martha set down the spur and moved to the window, peering through the shutters into the snowy night. A painted pony stood in her yard, its breath visible in the cold air, but no rider was visible. She waited, watching until a figure emerged from the shadows near her barn. It was the same man from the ridge, she was certain, though the falling snow and darkness made details difficult to distinguish. He moved with quiet confidence, his moccasined feet making no sound in the snow as he approached her cabin. This time he didn't circle the building or leave a gift by the door. Instead, he walked directly to her window and stood there, clearly visible in the lamplight that spilled through the shutters. Martha found herself looking directly into the face of a Lakota chief, for his bearing and dress marked him as a man of authority among his people. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with strong, angular features and intelligent dark eyes. His hair was indeed long, decorated with eagle feathers that marked his status, and he wore a beautifully crafted shirt of soft leather decorated with porcupine quill work and more of the fine beadwork she'd seen on the robe. For a long moment, they stared at each other through the glass and wooden slats, the White Widow and the Lakota chief, separated by more than just the cabin wall. Then he raised his hand, palm forward, in what Martha recognized as a gesture of peace. Slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, Martha raised her own hand and pressed it against the window glass. The chief nodded once, then stepped back into the darkness and was gone, his horse's hoofbeats quickly muffled by the falling snow. Martha sank back into her chair, pulling the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders. Whatever was happening between her and this mysterious Lakota chief, it was far more complex than simple charity. The expensive gift, the careful watching, the formal presentation of himself, all suggested a purpose she couldn't yet fathom. But as she returned to polishing Thomas's spur, working by the light of her guttering lamp, while snow piled against her windows, Martha realized that for the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. Someone was watching over her, someone who had reason to wish her harm, but chose instead to offer help. The question that would keep her awake through the long winter night was simple and terrifying. Why? The blizzard raged for 3 days, burying Martha's cabin in drifts that reached nearly to the windows. She'd never been more grateful for the buffalo robe, which kept her warm even as the temperature inside the cabin dropped so low she could see her breath. The storm gave her plenty of time to think, and by the third night, she'd reached a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. When the wind finally died and weak morning sunlight struggled through the heavy clouds, Martha wrapped herself in the buffalo robe and stepped outside. The world had been transformed into a pristine white landscape that sparkled like diamonds in the pale light. Her breath formed thick clouds as she waded through knee-deep snow toward the ridge where the Lakota chief had appeared. She had no plan beyond reaching that spot. Some instinct told her that if she went there, he would come. The climb was exhausting in the deep snow, and by the time she reached the crest of the hill, her legs ached and her lungs burned from the cold air. But she'd been right about his vigilance. He was waiting for her. The chief sat on his painted horse about 50 yards away, perfectly still against the white backdrop. His mount was a magnificent animal, a pinto with bold black and white markings that seemed almost too striking to be real. Both horse and rider appeared completely unbothered by the harsh conditions that had Martha shivering despite the warm robe. In the clear morning light, she could see him more distinctly than ever before. He was indeed young for a chief, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of a hard life lived outdoors. His clothing was rich with decoration, not the crude work she might have expected, but the finest examples of Plains Indian craftsmanship she'd ever seen. This was clearly a man of significant status among his people. For several minutes they regarded each other in silence. Then Martha did something that surprised even herself. She pulled the buffalo robe from her shoulders and held it up, displaying its beauty to the man who'd given it to her. The wind whipped at her thin dress, instantly chilling her to the bone, but she wanted him to see her appreciation for the gift. The chief nudged his horse forward, closing the distance between them by half. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, his voice deep and resonant in the still air. "You are cold, Martha Calloway." Hearing her name from his lips sent a shock through her system. How did he know who she was? But then, of course, he would know. In this sparsely settled territory, every homestead was known to the tribes that moved through the region. "Yes," she replied simply, wrapping the robe around herself again. "Thank you for the warmth." He nodded once, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Your husband fought with honor." The words hit her like a physical blow. Martha's knees nearly buckled as the implications crashed over her. This man had been there. He'd been present during the raid that killed Thomas. He might even have been the one who killed him. "You were there that day," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was there." His admission was matter-of-fact, without apology or explanation. He died as a warrior dies, facing his enemies. Martha felt tears freezing on her cheeks before she realized she was crying. The image of Thomas's final moments, painted by this man's words, was both comforting and devastating. He'd died bravely. She'd always hoped that was true, but hearing it confirmed by one who'd witnessed it brought both relief and renewed grief. "Did you—" she began, then stopped, not sure she wanted to know the answer. "I did not take his life," the chief said, understanding her unfinished question, "but I took these from the battlefield." He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something that gleamed in the morning light, the mate to the spurs she'd been polishing. This one was already cleaned and polished to perfection, its steel surface mirror bright. "His honor spurs," the chief continued, "given for courage in battle against my people 2 winters ago at the Washita River. He wore them that day." Martha's mind reeled. Thomas had never told her about receiving honor spurs, had never mentioned the battle at Washita River, but then he'd shared very little about his military service, always changing the subject when she asked about his experiences. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why did you take them? Why bring them to me?" The chief was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the horizon where smoke rose from some distant fire. When he looked back at her, there was something like respect in his eyes. A warrior's honor should not lie forgotten in the earth. These belong with his woman, not buried with the dead. They are proof of what he was, a man who fought without fear, even knowing he would not survive. "But he was your enemy," Martha protested. "Your people killed him." "Yes," the chief agreed simply, "but enemies can honor each other. Your husband could have run when he saw us coming. Instead, he stood between our war party and the other settlers' cabins, giving them time to escape. He knew he would die, but he did not abandon his duty." The revelation hit Martha like a sledgehammer. She'd never known exactly how Thomas had died, only that his body was found near the creek. Now she understood. He'd sacrificed himself to save others, had chosen to make his stand alone against overwhelming odds, to give innocent people a chance to flee. 3 women and their children reached the fort because of his courage, the chief continued. "Even my warriors spoke of his bravery around our fires that night." Martha sank to her knees in the snow, overwhelmed by grief and pride and confusion. The buffalo robe pooled around her as she wept openly, mourning not just her husband's death but the heroic life he'd lived without ever boasting of his deeds. He'd been a better man than she'd even known, and now his enemy was honoring that goodness. The chief dismounted and approached her, his moccasins silent in the snow, When he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "I am Standing Bear of the Lakota. I have watched over you because your husband's courage earned my respect. A woman who mourns such a man deserves protection, not more sorrow." Martha looked up at him through her tears. Standing Bear. She'd heard the name whispered around Fort Laramie, always with a mixture of fear and grudging admiration. He was said to be one of the most skilled war chiefs among the Lakota, a man who'd never been defeated in battle and who commanded absolute loyalty from his warriors. "I don't understand," she whispered. "We're supposed to be enemies." "War makes enemies of many who might otherwise be friends," Standing Bear replied, extending his hand to help her rise. "Your husband understood this. In our final moments together, I saw in his eyes not hatred but sadness for what had to be." Martha stared at his offered hand for a long moment. Taking it would mean accepting something she couldn't fully comprehend, a connection with the man whose people had destroyed her life, but who now offered her the only kindness she'd known in months. Finally, she reached out and allowed him to pull her to her feet. His grip was strong and warm, his calloused palms speaking of a lifetime spent working with horses and weapons. For just an instant, she glimpsed what Thomas might have seen in those final moments, not a savage enemy, but a man bound by his own code of honor. "The other spur," she said, her voice still shaky. "I've been polishing it every night." Standing Bear smiled, the first time she'd seen any warmth in his stern features. "Good. They should be together, as they were when your husband wore them into battle. Will you accept both now and the story that comes with them?" Martha nodded, unable to speak. Standing, Bear placed the polished spur in her hands, its metal still warm from his touch. The engravings matched those she'd been uncovering on its mate, for valor and Thomas's initials, along with the date of some forgotten battle where he'd proven his courage. As she cradled both spurs against her chest, Martha realized that her hatred had begun to transform into something else entirely. She still grieved for Thomas, would always mourn the life they'd been denied, but she could no longer see Standing Bear as simply the enemy. He was a man of honor, who'd chosen to honor her husband's memory in the most meaningful way possible. The wind picked up again, swirling snow around them, and reminding Martha of the practical realities of their situation. She was still a white woman alone on the frontier, and he was still a Lakota war chief. The respect growing between them couldn't change the larger conflict that raged across the territory. "What happens now?" she asked. Standing Bear remounted his horse, looking down at her with those intelligent, dark eyes. "Now you know the truth about your husband's death. What you do with that truth is your choice, Martha Calloway." He turned his horse toward the distant mountains, then paused and looked back at her one final time. "The spurs should be kept together," he said, "but not hidden away like shameful secrets. They are proof of honor, yours to display, and his to be remembered by." With that he rode away, his horse's hooves carrying him swiftly across the snowy landscape until he disappeared into the vast whiteness of the Wyoming wilderness. Martha stood alone on the ridge, holding her husband's honor spurs and wrapped in a buffalo robe, given to her by the enemy who'd chosen to become her protector. Nothing would ever be simple again. 2 weeks passed without any sign of Standing Bear, and Martha began to wonder if their encounter on the ridge had been their final meeting. She'd placed both spurs on her mantelpiece, polished to gleaming perfection, where they caught the lamplight each evening like twin stars. The buffalo robe had become as essential to her survival as food and water, its warmth allowing her to endure nights that would have been unbearable otherwise. But the isolation was taking its toll. Her supplies were running dangerously low. The blizzard had prevented her from reaching the cache of preserved meat she'd buried near the creek, and her small store of flour and beans wouldn't last another month. More troubling still were the signs she'd begun noticing around her property: boot prints that weren't hers, horse tracks that appeared overnight, and the uneasy feeling of being watched by unfriendly eyes. The answer to her unspoken fears came on a gray February morning, when she woke to find 5 men on horseback, arranged in a semicircle in front of her cabin. They weren't soldiers. Their clothes were a mixture of civilian garb and military surplus. Their horses bore no army brands, and their weapons were held with the casual readiness of men accustomed to violence. Martha recognized the type immediately, the kind of men who drifted west after the war, carrying their taste for conflict into the territories where law was sparse and justice often came from the barrel of a gun. She watched them through her shutters, her heart hammering as their leader, a bearded man with cruel eyes and a Confederate cavalry saber at his side, dismounted and approached her door. "Mrs. Calloway," he called out, his voice carrying the accent of Georgia or Alabama. "We know you're in there. Come on out and let's have ourselves a talk." Martha checked the cylinder of Thomas's Colt. Still only 5 bullets, and facing 5 men. The mathematics of survival were brutally clear. She cracked the door just enough to speak through the gap, keeping the revolver ready. "What do you want?" "Name's Colonel Briggs," the man replied, though his claim to military rank was almost certainly self-appointed. "We're what you might call concerned citizens, looking into reports of Indian activity in this area." "I haven't seen any Indians," Martha lied, her voice steady despite her fear. Briggs laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Now, Mrs. Calloway, that's peculiar, because we've been watching this area for days, and we've seen plenty of sign, fresh horse tracks, unshod ponies, the kind of tracks a war party leaves behind." Martha's blood turned to ice. If they'd been watching, they might have seen Standing Bear, and if they'd seen him, her connection to him would make her a target for their vigilante justice. "More interesting still," Briggs continued, "is that fine buffalo robe you've been wearing. That's Lakota work, Mrs. Calloway, the kind of gift one might receive for services rendered." The implication in his voice was unmistakable and vile. Martha's grip tightened on the Colt as rage swept through her, temporarily overwhelming her fear. "Get off my property," she said, her voice cold as January wind. "I'm afraid we can't do that, ma'am. You see, we've got us a situation here. Either you've been consorting with hostiles, or you're harboring information about their movements. So either way, we need to have ourselves a longer conversation." One of Briggs's men had circled around to the back of the cabin while they talked. Martha heard his boots on the wooden steps of her back door and realized her position was hopeless. 5 armed men against 1 woman with a half-empty revolver. The outcome was predetermined. Then she heard it. The thunder of hoofbeats approaching at full gallop, coming from the ridge where Standing Bear so often appeared. But this wasn't the measured pace of a single horse. This was multiple riders moving fast, and the sound was growing louder by the second. Briggs heard it too. He spun toward the sound, his hand moving to his sidearm as his expression shifted from predatory confidence to wariness. His men began gathering their reins, their horses dancing nervously as the hoofbeats grew closer. Standing Bear appeared first, cresting the ridge on his painted horse with his Winchester rifle already in his hands. But he wasn't alone. 6 Lakota warriors followed him, all armed and painted for war, their horses streaming across the snow-covered ground like avenging spirits. "Jesus Christ," one of Briggs's men whispered, his face going pale. "That's Standing Bear." The name hit the vigilantes like a physical blow. Even men who made their living through violence knew better than to face Standing Bear and his warriors in open combat. The war chief's reputation preceded him, a tactician who'd never lost a battle, whose mere presence could turn a fight before the first shot was fired. Standing Bear reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin, his dark eyes taking in the scene with tactical precision. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You are on land under my protection, white men. Leave now and live to see tomorrow's dawn." Briggs was sweating despite the cold, but he was too proud or too foolish to back down immediately. "This is a white woman's property, Indian. We've got legal business here." "Your law has no power where honor is concerned," Standing Bear replied. "This woman is under my protection because her husband died with courage. Any who harm her will answer to me." The other warriors had spread out in a loose line, their rifles trained on Briggs and his men. Martha noticed that they were all young men, probably in their 20s, but their bearing spoke of extensive combat experience. These weren't reservation Indians playing at war. These were seasoned fighters who'd chosen to follow Standing Bear, despite the risks. "You threatening American citizens?" Briggs demanded, though his voice had lost much of its earlier bravado. "I am stating a fact," Standing Bear said calmly. "Martha Calloway mourns a warrior. That makes her a warrior's widow, deserving of respect. You offer her disrespect. This cannot be allowed." One of Briggs's men, apparently smarter than his leader, was already mounting his horse. "Colonel," he said urgently, "we should go. This ain't worth it." But Briggs was trapped by his own reputation and his men's expectations. To retreat without a fight would mark him as a coward, but to fight Standing Bear was likely suicide. Martha watched the calculation play out across his weathered features as he weighed pride against survival. The decision was taken out of his hands when Standing Bear spoke again, his voice carrying a note of finality that chilled the air. "I have been generous with words. Now I offer you one last choice. Mount your horses and ride away, or we will settle this as warriors settle things. But know that if you choose to fight, none of you will live to boast of it." The threat was delivered without bluster or emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. Martha had no doubt that Standing Bear meant every word, and neither did Briggs. The man's hand moved away from his weapon as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his pride. "This ain't over," Briggs muttered, backing toward his horse. "A white woman taking gifts from savages. The authorities will hear about this." "Tell them," Standing Bear replied indifferently. "Tell them also that those who threaten her will find me waiting for them." Briggs and his men mounted quickly, their movements sharp with barely controlled panic. As they rode away toward the main trail, Martha could hear them arguing among themselves, their voices carrying accusations and recriminations across the still air. When they were gone, Standing Bear dismounted and approached the cabin. His warriors remained on their horses, alert and ready, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the vigilante's return. "Are you harmed?" Standing Bear asked, his voice gentler now that the immediate threat had passed. Martha stepped outside, still clutching the colt but feeling oddly calm despite what had just happened. "No, but they'll be back, won't they? Maybe with more men." Standing Bear nodded grimly. "Men like that do not forget perceived slights. And now they know of the connection between us." He paused, studying her face. "This complicates things." "I never asked for your protection," Martha said, though there was no anger in her voice. "No," Standing Bear agreed, "but your husband's honor demands it, and my own honor requires that I give it. The question now is whether you can accept what that means." Martha looked at the warriors who'd risked their lives to defend her, young men who could have been living peacefully on the reservation, but had chosen instead to follow Standing Bear in his defiance of the white authorities. They'd painted themselves for war and ridden to her rescue without hesitation, all because their chief had deemed her worthy of protection. "What does it mean?" she asked. Standing Bear's expression was grave. "It means you are no longer simply a white woman living alone on the frontier. You are now a symbol of the connection between our peoples, a connection that many on both sides will see as betrayal. It means your life has become part of something larger than yourself." Martha understood. By accepting Standing Bear's gifts, by allowing him to protect her, she'd crossed an invisible line that separated the white and Indian worlds. There would be no going back to the simple grief of widowhood. Her future was now bound to the complex web of honor and conflict that defined the frontier. "The storm that's coming will be larger than today's trouble," Standing Bear warned. "Are you prepared for that?" Martha looked at the spurs gleaming on her mantelpiece, then at the buffalo robe that had kept her alive through the winter's worst nights. She thought of Thomas's sacrifice and Standing Bear's unexpected honor, of the choice between the easy hatred that society expected and the difficult path of understanding that her heart was beginning to choose. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'm not running away." Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "Then we will face whatever comes together, but first, you cannot remain here alone. Tonight you will come to our winter camp, where you will be truly safe until we can determine what Briggs and his kind plan to do." The invitation was unprecedented, a white woman brought into a Lakota camp as an honored guest. Martha realized that Standing Bear was offering her not just protection, but acceptance into his world, at least temporarily. It was a gesture that would have been unthinkable just months earlier, but now felt like the natural next step in a relationship that had already shattered every convention she'd ever known. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come with you." Standing Bear smiled, the second time she'd seen warmth break through his stern demeanor. "Good. Bring the spurs. Tonight, you will hear the full story of your husband's last battle, told as our people tell such stories, with the honor it deserves." As Martha gathered her few possessions and prepared to leave the cabin that had been her refuge, she realized that her old life was ending and something entirely new was beginning. She was about to step into a world she'd been taught to fear, guided by a man she'd been raised to see as her enemy, all because a code of honor transcended the boundaries that others tried to impose. The transformation was complete. She was no longer just Thomas Calloway's widow. She was becoming something unprecedented in this territory, a bridge between two worlds that had forgotten how to coexist. The Lakota winter camp was unlike anything Martha had ever imagined. Hidden in a sheltered valley 20 miles from her homestead, it consisted of perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a careful circle, their buffalo hide walls glowing warmly in the light of numerous fires. Smoke rose from the smoke holes in gentle spirals, and the sound of voices, children playing, women working, Men discussing the day's events created an atmosphere of community that Martha hadn't experienced since leaving civilization. Standing Bear led her to a lodge near the center of the camp, where an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair waited to greet them. She spoke no English, but her gestures of welcome were unmistakable as she helped Martha down from the horse Standing Bear had provided and ushered her into the warm interior of the teepee. "My mother, Blue Sky Woman," Standing Bear explained as they settled around the central fire. "She has prepared a place for you to stay as long as necessary." The lodge was spacious and comfortable, furnished with backrests made of willow and buffalo hide, sleeping robes arranged around the walls, and various tools and decorations that spoke of a lifetime of skilled craftsmanship. Blue Sky Woman served them a meal of buffalo stew, fry bread and wild berry tea, all the while studying Martha with sharp, intelligent eyes. That evening, as snow began to fall again outside, Standing Bear kept his promise about telling Thomas's story. Word had spread through the camp about their unusual guest, and gradually the lodge filled with warriors, women, and elders who'd come to hear the tale. Martha found herself the center of attention in a way she'd never expected, not as a curiosity or an enemy, but as someone whose presence honored their traditions. Standing Bear spoke in Lakota, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of a practiced storyteller. Though Martha couldn't understand the words, she could feel the power of the narrative in the way his listeners responded, gasps of surprise, murmurs of approval, and respectful silence during the most dramatic moments. When he finished, several of the warriors spoke up, apparently adding their own observations or asking questions. "What did you tell them?" Martha asked when the crowd had dispersed, leaving only Standing Bear, his mother, and Martha around the dying fire. "I told them how your husband fought at the creek that day," Standing Bear replied. "How he could have fled when he saw us coming, but chose instead to make his stand in the open where we would have to fight him before reaching the other cabins. How he killed 2 of my warriors and wounded a 3rd before our arrows found him. How he died on his feet, still holding his rifle, refusing to fall even when mortally wounded." Martha felt tears threatening again. "I never knew he was so brave. He never spoke of fighting." "Good men rarely boast of war," Blue Sky Woman said in careful English, surprising Martha. The old woman's voice was soft but firm. "Your husband was what we call Takoja waste, a good relative. He fought as a warrior should fight, with courage but without hatred. This is why my son honors his memory." "But he was your enemy," Martha said, still struggling to understand the seeming contradiction. "In war, yes," Standing Bear agreed. "But war does not erase the bonds between honorable people. Your husband and I, we understood each other in those final moments. He saw that I took no joy in his death, and I saw that he bore no hatred for mine. We were simply 2 men doing what our duties required." The conversation continued late into the night, with Standing Bear and his mother sharing stories of their own losses in the ongoing conflict. Blue Sky Woman had lost a son at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Standing Bear's younger brother had died in a cavalry attack the previous spring. Yet neither spoke with bitterness. Their words carried grief, but also acceptance of the harsh realities of frontier life. Martha spent 3 days in the Lakota camp, learning more about her husband and herself than she'd discovered in months of solitary grief. The warriors treated her with respectful courtesy. The women included her in their daily activities despite the language barrier, and the children regarded her with curious but friendly interest. She began to understand that these people, so demonized in the white settlements, were simply families trying to survive in a world that had turned hostile to their way of life. On the 4th morning, one of Standing Bear's scouts returned with troubling news. Briggs had indeed gathered more men, nearly 20 now, including some off-duty soldiers from Fort Laramie who were sympathetic to his views. They'd been asking questions in the nearest town, spreading stories about Martha's collaboration with hostiles and demanding that the authorities take action. "They're planning to burn your cabin," Standing Bear told her as they stood outside the lodge, watching the morning sun paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink. "And if they find you there, they'll claim you were harboring enemies and deal with you accordingly." Martha nodded, having expected something of the sort. "Then I can't go back. Not to the cabin, no. But there may be another way." Standing Bear paused, choosing his words carefully. "The Indian agent at the Pine Ridge Agency has been asking for someone to serve as interpreter and cultural liaison, someone who understands both worlds and can help prevent misunderstandings that lead to violence." The idea was startling. "You're suggesting I work for the Indian Agency?" I'm suggesting you use your unique position to build bridges instead of watching them burn, Standing Bear replied. Your husband died trying to protect innocent people. Perhaps you can honor his memory by preventing the deaths of other innocents. Martha considered the proposal. It would mean leaving her homestead forever, abandoning the life she'd tried to build with Thomas. But that life was already gone, destroyed by violence and hatred that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. Perhaps it was time to choose a different path. There's something else, Standing Bear continued. The agency position would provide you with protection and legitimacy that even men like Briggs couldn't challenge directly, and it would allow us to maintain our connection without endangering either of our peoples. Our connection, Martha repeated, understanding that he was offering something more permanent than temporary protection. Standing Bear met her gaze directly. You are not just any white woman to me now, Martha Calloway. You are the widow of a warrior I respected, and you have shown courage in accepting the friendship of his former enemies. In my culture, such bonds are not broken by death or differences in blood. The implications were clear, though neither of them spoke them aloud. They were proposing to formalize a relationship that transcended racial boundaries. Not marriage in the white sense, but something deeper and more complex. A union based on mutual respect and shared understanding of loss. That afternoon, Martha made her decision. Standing Bear would escort her to Pine Ridge, where she would begin her new life as a bridge between worlds. Her cabin and the memories it held would be left behind, but Thomas's spurs would go with her, polished symbols of the honor that had brought her and Standing Bear together. The journey to Pine Ridge took 4 days, traveling carefully to avoid both Briggs's vigilantes and any cavalry patrols that might misinterpret their small party. Standing Bear rode beside Martha the entire way, their conversations ranging from practical matters to deeper questions about the future might build together. When they finally reached the agency, Martha realized how much she'd changed. The terrified widow who'd learned to... She was no longer simply white or simply widowed. She was something new, something that hadn't existed before in this territory. The Indian agent, a tired but well-meaning man named Morrison, was grateful to have someone who could speak both languages and understand both cultures. Martha's first assignment was to help mediate a dispute over cattle that had wandered onto tribal land, a minor matter that could easily have escalated into violence without proper communication. As she worked, Standing Bear remained nearby, ostensibly visiting the agency on tribal business, but actually ensuring her safety during the transition. In the evenings, they would walk together along the creek that ran past the agency buildings, talking about the day's challenges and the larger questions of how two vastly different peoples might learn to coexist. One evening, as spring began to soften the harsh edges of winter, Martha showed Standing Bear the fully restored spurs, now mounted in a place of honor in her small quarters. They gleamed in the lamplight, their engravings clearly visible, bearing witness to Thomas's courage and the unexpected path that courage had opened. He would be proud, Standing Bear said quietly. His death brought enemies together and prevented many others. That is a warrior's greatest victory. Martha nodded, understanding at last why Standing Bear had felt compelled to return the spurs to her. They weren't just mementos of the past, they were symbols of the future, proof that honor could transcend the artificial divisions that men created to justify their fears and hatred. What happens now? She asked, echoing her question from that snowy ridge months earlier. Standing Bear smiled, the expression that had become increasingly common as their relationship deepened. Now we continue building the bridge your husband's sacrifice began. It won't be easy. There will always be those like Briggs who profit from conflict and fear, but others will see what we've accomplished and understand that another way is possible. Martha looked out at the peaceful valley where Lakota families lived alongside white agency employees and visiting traders, where children of both races played together without the hatred their parents had inherited. It wasn't paradise. Tension still existed, misunderstanding still occurred, and the larger conflicts of the territory continued to rage. But it was a beginning, a small circle of understanding in a world torn by division. She thought of Thomas, buried in the cemetery near Fort Laramie with his regulation spurs, while his honor spurs had found their way back to her through the most unlikely of messengers. He died defending others, and his death had ultimately created the very understanding he'd given his life to make possible. The circle was complete. The rusted spurs had been polished to brilliant shine. The buffalo robe had provided warmth through the darkest winter, and the enemy who'd taken a warrior's life had become the protector of that warrior's widow. In the harsh mathematics of frontier justice, It should have been impossible. But honor had its own mathematics, its own logic that transcended the simple equations of revenge and hatred. As Martha settled into her new life at Pine Ridge, she kept the spurs on her mantelpiece where they caught the light each evening, reminding her daily of the courage that had brought her to this unexpected place. They were polished now, gleaming and perfect, but they would never again be worn into battle. Instead, they stood as silent witnesses to a different kind of victory, the triumph of understanding over ignorance, of respect over hatred, of the bonds that could unite people across any divide if they had the courage to honor them. Thomas's sacrifice had not been in vain, Standing Bear's honor had not been misplaced, and Martha had found not just survival, but purpose, in a world that had tried to convince her that understanding was impossible. The spurs gleamed in the lamplight, and Martha smiled, knowing that somewhere in the mountains beyond Pine Ridge, a Lakota war chief was also looking toward the future, and seeing not just the continuation of old conflicts, but the possibility of something entirely new. Something that began with two people choosing honor over hatred, and understanding over fear. The circle was complete, but the story, their story, was just beginning.